everyone, I'm Ajanette, and I am going to be going over your Module 1 overview. Now this module is fairly quick because it only includes one chapter. Most of our modules will include multiple chapters, but this one is just really laying the foundation for you. So the module overview is really going to first kind of outline all the concepts you should have learned. So it's kind of a good review point for you to say, did I watch all the lecture videos? Did I do all my reading? Am I really understanding the conceptual information needed to move on to the next skills or skill development? So what we're going to do is take that knowledge and then learn about SPSS and apply that knowledge to SPSS. And SPSS will be using to input data and analyze outputs to draw conclusions. And so we're going to scaffold you and in baby steps teach you how to use SPSS as a tool, as a statistician and as a researcher. So we're going to first kind of go over what key terms and concepts you should have learned from Chapter 1. So this module only covers Chapter 1. Ideally, you should have done the reading for Chapter 1, and you should have looked at the lecture slides for Chapter 1, and you should have watched the lecture video for Chapter 1. And for those of you that are taking notes and submitting your notes for your assignments, that's fine. Otherwise, I think it's really helpful while you're watching the lecture to do those learning activities that are interactive. Stop the video, do them, test yourself. If you're not understanding, go back and do more reading until you kind of understand why the correct answers are correct. And then do the answers, the odd problems at the end of the book, and check your answers against the back of the book. So that's the most helpful way you're really going to learn. Do your reading, review your lecture slides, watch your lecture video, stop it, pause it, do the interactive learning checks, take thorough notes, and ideally do the odd problems at the end of the book. If you do all of that, that's the best way to learn. But you are only required to do either the notes or the odd problems at the end of the book. It's up to you. Additionally, you'll do the chapter quizzes for each chapter. So after Chapter 1 in Module 1, what you should really have learned is the difference between descriptive and inferential stats, where descriptive is just a way to describe, simplify, organize data, and inferential allows us to draw inferences or answer research questions. You should be able to identify the difference between a population and a sample, where the population is the general overall group that we want to draw conclusions to or understand, and the sample is the group of individuals we actually can collect data from and include in our study. So the sample is very reasonable. They should be representative of the population, but it's almost impossible to gather data from the entire population. You should know the difference between a datum, which is a singular piece of data for one participant, and a data or data set, which is plural, the overall data that we're looking at for the entire study. Statistics correspond to samples, and parameters correspond to populations. It's going to be really important down the road. Sampling error occurs when we can never, samples represent the population, but they can never replicate the population exactly. There's always going to be some margin of error, and that's what sampling error is. We expect a little bit of difference between our samples and our populations. The variable is the item that we are measuring or that we are studying. Okay, it can be a grouping variable, it can be a measured variable, but it's what we're studying, and it varies across individuals, circumstances, groups, and we want to see the factors under which it might vary, what might contribute to the variations. Data is either discrete or continuous. So discrete, it's going to stay in whole chunks. It can't be broken up into little bitty pieces. Continuous data can be broken up into little bitty pieces. So if I'm talking about people, those can't be broken up into itty bitty pieces. If I'm talking about money, I can break it up into pennies, okay? So people is discrete, money is continuous. Then we talk about scales of measurement, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal, where they're categorically different, they're different in name only, inherently discrete. Ordinal, where they're going to be ranked, they show up in a particular order, but there's not equal distances between the ranks. Interval, where now they are still ranked, but there's equal distances between the ranks. No true zero. Ratio, they are ranked, equal distances between the ranks, and a true zero. In SPSS, you're going to find that SPSS treats interval and ratio data exactly the same. It is called scale data. So SPSS doesn't care if there's a true zero. It's going to treat them exactly the same. You also should have learned about different data structures, and this is really important. Ideally, you learn this in other classes too, introductory classes. But you're going to learn that we use statistics in a correlational method where we're kind of looking at data where the structure only includes measured data, right? We're not breaking anybody into groups and comparing any groups, right, or anything between groups. I'm really just looking at a bunch of measurements and how those variables relate to one another. Comparison structures are a little bit different. Now I'm breaking things into groups and I'm comparing scores between groups. And that's a little bit different. So in correlational structures, I only have measured variables. In comparison structures, I have grouping variables, so I know who's in what group or how the groups were broken or created, how many groups there are, how many conditions in each group. And I also have a measured variable that I'm comparing between those groups. Now, how I create those groups determines whether it's experimental or non-experimental. Remember, experiments are the only method by which we can say that something causes a difference in something else. So we have to have control and manipulation. Our manipulation is our independent variable. It is, we determine how many groups we have, who goes into what group, and we randomly assign the participants across groups. And that's a measure of control, right? So we want to control confounding variables, outside variables that can systematically affect the outcome of our study unintentionally, right? So sometimes, let's say I want to look at, study difference in video game usage on aggressive, on aggression levels. And I want to say, okay, I'm going to assign these children to no video games, non-violent video games, and then violent video games. And I'm going to watch their aggression levels and measure their aggression levels. But I have to be careful because I don't want to just automatically assign all the aggressive children to watching or to playing the aggressive video games. And if they already self-select and just tell me what kind of video games they play, well, now there might be something about aggressive children that draws them to violent video games. So that's not an experiment, right? I can't say that the type of video game caused it because maybe it was their aggression level that caused them to select the video game. So in order to control that, I have to randomly assign, flip a coin and determine what group they're in. And then I am able to now say, okay, based upon that, I've evenly distributed, I've controlled any participant factors that might influence their aggression levels. So I've randomly assigned those across the groups, and now I'm going to let them play video games or not play video games. So maybe they're just watching a benign cartoon for 30 minutes. And I am going to, then watch their behavior on a playground for, let's say, 30 minutes. And I'm going to count the number of times they're aggressive. And I'm going to operationally define aggression as hitting, kicking, biting, pushing, yelling, calling names, teasing, excluding friends from playing with groups, things of that nature. Okay, so because I've controlled the environmental circumstances by making sure that each group is treated the same except for the type of video game they played, and I'm controlling for participant factors by randomly assigning them to groups, now I can say that if I'm seeing differences in aggression levels, it's because of the type of video game. So that's an experiment. It's much more detailed, it's much more analytical. Now, quite often in social sciences, we're studying things that we can't control in a laboratory setting like that. And so we often use non-experimental techniques. So when individuals come into groups already predetermined, and we're still making comparisons between those groups, but we don't randomly assign them to groups. They already come predetermined in those groups. Like, let's say we want to study aggression level between different gender identities. Well, we don't assign their gender identity. They come to us with gender identities. So that's a non-experimental study, but I'm still doing a comparison of aggression levels across the different gender identities. So I hope that makes sense to you. But that's the general overview of what we've covered in this particular class. Chapter and module. And so how does all this relate to SPSS? How is this going to impact my SPSS exam? Well, I want you to know that SPSS requires you to come in with foundational understanding of the concepts that were covered in that particular module. Okay? You have to recognize if you don't understand those concepts, it's garbage in, garbage out. SPSS can only do with it what you give it. Okay? So, although we haven't learned a lot yet in Chapter 1 or Module 1 that is going to be utilized in SPSS, we're kind of going to build a foundation and set a stage for what's to come. And what's to come is Module 2, where you're going to learn about frequency, tables and graphs. You're going to learn about measures of central tendency, which is your mean, median, and mode. You're going to learn about measures of variability. And you can actually input data into SPSS and create your frequency tables and graphs directly in SPSS. You can calculate your measures of central tendency, and you can calculate your measures of variability. Because SPSS does all the calculations for you, that's why I let you have the option of doing the calculations, doing the problems at the end of the book, or doing your lecture notes. If you can understand the concepts and use SPSS as your calculator, you're going to do just fine in statistics. However, for people like me, understanding the formulas and working things out helps me really understand the concepts of what I'm calculating. So I like to do the calculations and the problems at the end of the book, but you do what's best for you to suit your learning style. So there is an SPSS orientation video that I'm going to have you watch to demonstrate this live, but I want to give you just a quick general overview. When you get into SPSS, when you open SPSS, there's two separate screens, and they're in the bottom right corner. They're very small, so you can easily miss them, okay? The one that's highlighted, you can literally click back and forth on these, and the one that's highlighted is the screen that you're on. So since this is data view, we're looking at the data view screen right now in front of you. In the data view screen, each row represents a participant, okay? Each column represents a variable. We're going to look at the variable view and see that the data that you input for variable. But the variable view is going to describe each variable in SPSS. So you're telling SPSS what type of variable it is, what scale of measurement it is, you're giving it a name. In the data view, you're actually entering the actual raw scores that you collect from your participants. So this is the measured variables. This is where you put the measured variables or the measurements that you get from each participant. And you do that in each row, and each column is going to represent a variable that you created. So if you only have one variable, it's only going to be one column that's filled in. If it's two variables, you're going to have participants 1 data for the first variable, and then participant 1's data for the second variable. So now this is the variable view. Notice that now variable view is highlighted down at the bottom. Now, SPSS does a lot of the work for you, which is really nice. So when you hit enter, defaults will pop up. You have to pay attention to 4 columns. Your name column, which is actually the column where you're going to enter a name for SPSS to use behind the scenes. Now this column is a little particular. It doesn't let you use any spaces or any kind of special characters. And so it beeps at you and it kind of yells at you when you're doing those things. And so what I do is I just capitalize the first letter of each word that I use to describe the variable. Like if I said gender identity, I'd capitalize the G and capitalize the I, and I wouldn't put a space in between. Now, when I hit enter after I type gender identity and I click enter, now all these defaults are going to fill in. That's perfect. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy gender identity, Control C, and then I'm going to go over here to label and I'm going to do Control V, and I'm going to put a space in between gender identity. The difference between the name and the label is the name is what SPSS uses behind the scenes. So it's going to become the name for the column for each of the variables, right? But the label is going to show up in another SPSS screen, and that's called your output. The label should be as thorough and descriptive as possible, because when you run your analyses, you're going to print out the output, and the output needs to be clear so you know what it is that you're looking at, okay? So be as detailed as possible in your output. Additionally, you have to then ask yourself, what scale of measurement am I using? So we're going to skip this column and go over here to the measure column. And when you click on the measure column, you're going to get 3 options: nominal, ordinal, or scale. Remember, I said that scale is interval and ratio. SPSS treats those exactly the same. So I'm going to drop down and tell it which one it is. If it's nominal, I have to come back here to the values column and I have to code the data, okay? So if it's nominal, that means it's categorical. SPSS doesn't understand every possible category that exists in the world. So what we can do is give it a number to correspond to that particular category. So let's say I wanted to find out who prefers chocolate or vanilla ice cream. I'm going to assign a 1 to vanilla and a 2 to chocolate. And so if you tell me, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click. There's going to be a little box over here. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to say 1 is vanilla, 2 is chocolate. And I'm going to save those codes. Then when I go to the data view, I'm going to go and I'm going to say, okay, now my first participant liked vanilla, so they get a 1. My second participant liked chocolate, so they get a 2. My third participant liked chocolate, they get a 2. My fourth liked chocolate, they get a 2. My fifth liked chocolate, so they get a 2. So on and so forth till all my participants' data is entered. So I enter the actual number for the code that I gave to that particular category. Now remember, those codes are arbitrary. The numbers are completely arbitrary. I could have given chocolate a 1 and vanilla a 2, or chocolate a 0 and vanilla a 2, or chocolate 100 and vanilla a 0. I could give it whatever I wanted. So the numbers have no value for nominal data. You have to think about what nominal data is. It's categorical. They're different in name only. There's no quantitative value in the differences between those categories. And so because of that, I need to know the numbers mean nothing. So when I'm going to do other analyses, I have to keep that in mind, okay? It also is going to inform what I do later in terms of what kind of frequency graphs am I going to utilize. Is this discrete or continuous then? It's going to be discrete, right? Because it's when it's categorical, they have to stay in whole chunks. I can't break them up. I can only break up quantitative data, not qualitative. So those are all things I have to think about, okay? So you'll be building on that knowledge in future chapters, and that will affect how you input stuff in SPSS. Now for the variable view, each row actually is representing a variable, and then it becomes now a column in the data view when you're ready to input the raw scores or the raw data for each of your participants. Okay, so I'm just giving you an example of what a data set looks like, okay? This is actually a data set for a study that was conducted by some of my students a few semesters ago. We called it the Rise and Shine study, but we were looking at how early people wake up, whether they're morning or evening people in general, and we were comparing productivity levels and mood across those two groups, right? And so what you're seeing here is just the defaults that are used by SPSS for these three columns. Focus on the name, the label, the measure. Notice how we've identified what type of data it is. And then for all the nominal data, notice there's values entered, right? Because we coded them. For scale data, there's no values, okay? Notice here we don't have any spaces or special characters, but over here we do, okay? So that's in general what data is going to look like. Now you're going to start out in baby steps, so you're not going to collect as much data, or when you run an analysis, there won't be 15 pieces or 15 variables that you're entering data for. There may only be a few, okay? But recognize that when we collect data for a study that we're running, we typically have data for the variables that we're examining. So we have to put in data for our grouping variables that we're comparing. We have to put in data for our measured variables. And we have to put in data for our participant variables. So we have to collect data on our participants to make sure our sample is in fact representative of the larger population. Because if it's not, then we lose external validity. We can't generalize our findings, okay? Now, you can actually, I'm going to go back here. See right here when you click Analyze. Analyze is going to come up, and there is a bunch of different options, right? We can click on Descriptive Statistics just to get the basics for now. And when we click on Descriptive Statistics, there's a window that comes up where I can click on Statistics here, right? And I can tell it, give me the mean, median, and mode, the standard deviation, variance, and range. Now, again, I have to be logical. If it's nominal data, does this really matter, right? So use these when it matters. If it's qualitative data, these do not matter. They only matter for quantitative data, okay? I also have to think about what charts I want to use if I'm doing frequency graphs. For any kind of continuous data, I'm going to use histograms. Any type of nominal or discrete data, I'm going to use bar charts, okay? We don't use a whole lot of pie charts typically in this field. Maybe for a poster, but not typically in a professional paper, so to speak, okay? So that's just a sneak peek into some of the analyses that you'll be running. Now, this is a sneak peek into the output, okay? So again, what this is this is running the statistics, so the descriptive statistics for each variable for the Rise and Shine study, okay? We had 51 participants, and mind you, see, we coded, we broke them up into categories. So they wake up before 8 or after 8, right? So they got a 1 or a 2. These numbers mean nothing because that was a nominal variable. So none of that matters. The productivity rating is in fact a quantitative data. So that's fine, right? But this is qualitative. So I have to know when I'm running these analyses, which analyses does it make sense to run? I always think it's just easier to run them all for all the data that you have. However, that can be confusing because then you have to understand which data is important on your output. So it kind of is a matter of preference, right? If you're saving time on one end, you have to really be discerning on the other end, or you can be discerning and invest that time on the front end, and then your output is clearer on the back end. Whatever works for you. So this is just a sneak peek into what comes ahead. For the purposes of your SPSS exam, what you're going to do now is you're going to answer some questions, kind of like an essay question, and they're going to have some questions where you're having to identify these key terms, right? So you have to differentiate between samples and populations. You have to differentiate between discrete versus continuous, scales of measurement, experimental or non-experimental. So you're going to have some practice doing those things to build that knowledge base now that you're going to build on later, okay? And then you are going to dive into SPSS a little bit, and you're going to play around entering some data and explaining some data. And what you'll do is you'll open your SPSS exam. It's a Word doc. You'll answer the questions directly on that Word doc. Embed your SPSS images, screens, or output directly into that Word doc. Explain what you need to explain. Save it, and then upload it into Canvas. And so more instructions will be provided for you directly in Canvas. I hope you're not intimidated so far. Know that I'm here to support you. Know that you can reach out and form study groups so that you can support one another. But this class is manageable. I promise you. I am not a math geek. I don't love math. I don't love stats. But I am good at breaking things down and helping you to understand them. So if you don't give up on you, I won't give up on you. Please reach out if you need help. Thank you so much. Have a good one.